Welcome everyone to our final pre-draft live stream alongside Tom Silverstein. I am Olivia Reiner. The Packers have so many needs in this year's draft, from wide receiver to cornerback to offensive line. It might be easier to work backwards a little bit and consider who the Packers won't be targeting in this year's draft. That is exactly what we are going to do today. Before we get into that, as always, you know the drill at this point. You can be a part of our conversation. If you're over on Facebook, Periscope, YouTube, leave us a question down in the chat. Tom and I always want to hear from you. We'll get to some of your thoughts toward the end of our conversation today. Let's start with the defensive line. Aside from nose tackle Kenny Clark last year, who missed the first half of the season due to a groin injury, the Packers lacked consistent pass rush from the interior defensive line. Kingsley Keke and Dean Lowry only combined for 7 sacks all season. That might mean that the Packers could be interested in adding to the defensive line room through the draft. However, Pro Football Focus has projected that most teams across the NFL are only going to allocate, on average, 7% of their draft capital towards interior defensive linemen in this year's draft. Why? It's because the interior defensive line group isn't supposed to be as strong. How does general manager Brian Gutekunst approach this year's draft, especially at the defensive line?
Well, very cautiously. I don't know that this is the year to address it unless you're absolutely desperate. I mean, I think there will be someone who takes a flyer on Christian. Of course, his name is escaping me at this point, from Alabama, the big good. Just because of his size and his pedigree and having played at Alabama. But I think defensive line is really boom or bust position. And it's much better, if you're going to boom or bust, to try it in the 6th round or 5th round. I think the Packers have had a lot of problems with taking defensive linemen too high. And I would be really surprised if they addressed it before the 5th round.
7% draft capital, that figure that I mentioned from Pro Football Focus earlier, is down from 11% on average over the past 10 years. So pretty substantial. If the Packers aren't able to find a defensive lineman in this year's draft, they do have other options. They could try to target a veteran free agent after the draft. Players like Geno Atkins and Jarrell Casey are still available. Atkins is 33 years old, Casey is 31 years old. How much firepower do either of them have and their ability to contribute in the pass rush?
Well, that's to be determined. And I think it's risky anytime you're going for an older guy on the defensive line. You know, they tried Snacks Harrison last year, and it didn't really do all that much good for them. I think, you know, there are some other options depending on how Joe Barry plays it, and that would be to give Rashawn Gary some snaps inside. Zadarius Smith could be a defensive end in a 5-man front. Same with Gary. They could wind up drafting a fairly good size edge rusher that they could put in at end, or, you know, there might be a 5 technique there that slips through. So I think there are options. I don't think their cupboard is bare. I think they could do better. I think Kingsley Keke is a legitimate starter next year. But I don't think it's the end of the world. I do think they could be better there, though.
Let's discuss the cornerback position. The Packers may be interested in taking a cornerback this year, with cornerback Kevin King slated to become a free agent after this season. Same with Josh Jackson. However, as always, they're going to have to do their due diligence when it comes to injuries. 2 of the top cornerbacks in this year's draft have dealt with injuries in their recent history. If you look at a player like Caleb Farley, he's had 2 back surgeries since 2019, and he is only 22 years old. And then someone like cornerback Greg Newsome out of Northwestern, he's only played 21 games over 3 seasons in his collegiate career, meaning that he has missed at least 3 games due to injury in each of his seasons. How does that impact their grade on the Packers draft board?
Well, I've talked to some people who essentially, you know, watch the Packers and how they draft and how they assess people, and most of them feel like they would not pass Caleb Farley on physical. That their medical staff will say that's just too risky. I don't know that for a fact, but that's the impression that league people get. I think Newsome too. He doesn't. Well, he's a really good man coverage person. He's frail. He's had the injury issues. The Packers like some strength. They've seen what happens, and Kevin King. They end up injured all the time. So I would think they'd stay away from him as well. If they're going to go corner, they're going to look for a good sized guy in the second round, maybe.
When it comes to cornerback, another area that the Packers historically have been weary of is short cornerbacks. And by short, I mean quarterbacks under 5'10" and a half, essentially. The only exception to that rule in recent history was Jair Alexander back in 2018. He is 5'10". A couple of the top cornerback prospects in this year's draft are a little bit shorter than the Packers would typically go for. Someone like Florida State's Asante Samuel Jr., he is 5'10" and 1/8 of an inch. Do not forget the 1/8. It is very important. Cornerback Elijah Molden out of Washington, he is 5'9", which is quite a bit shorter than what the Packers would typically go for. How does that height consideration go into Brian Gutekunst's decision-making come draft time?
Heavily, I think. I would, the reason they made an exception, I think, with Jair Alexander, one, he ran a 4.38 40-yard dash. The other is he plays physical. He's not a slight guy. He's 12 pounds heavier, I think, than Asante Samuel, and they have similar testing skills. They're similar height. They both run about the same. But Jair Alexander is, as you can see, game to game, the guy can be very physical. So they made an exception, but they took into consideration he's 192 pounds. I think, Molden, they're just not going to go 5'9". You can't have too many of those guys. You can get away with one of them, or maybe a second guy's fourth string backup or something like that. But I think if they go corner, they're going to go for someone bigger. And I could see them addressing that in the second round, maybe the third round.
Let's head over to our Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube pages right now for some of your questions. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. Gary wants to continue the conversation about cornerbacks. Gary says, I think a lot of the Packers' draft choices will depend on what talent is out there. I mean, number 29, a lot of the top talent is going to go. Balanced with team needs, do you think a cornerback would be one of the first choices? Tommy just said that maybe the Packers would look in the second round for a cornerback. However, if one of the top four corners is still there at number 29, how inclined would the Packers be to go after him?
Well, I don't think they would. I mean, unless J.C. Horn dropped out. I mean, Surtain's not going to drop down to where they're at. And for some reason, J.C. Horn did. Those are the top two corners. Sure, they'd take them in a New York minute, but I don't think they're going to stretch for the other two guys. I don't think they're going to take a corner. I think in this case they want a corner, but it's just not going to happen. And they don't really have. I don't think they want to trade all the way up to the middle of the round to try to get Horn or Surtain. So I wouldn't expect a corner in the first round, but I could easily see them. I could see them dropping back in the first, from the first round to the second round, and then taking a corner, one of the two Georgia corners, Tyson Campbell or Eric Stokes, early in the second round, something like that. That would be where they would get a corner, their first pick, but not in the first round.
Brian Gutekunst has shown that he likes to be aggressive in these drafts. In his past 3 drafts, he has moved around in the first round 3 times. However, to move up to acquire Horn, it's very possible that both of those top 2 cornerbacks could be gone by pick number 15. It would take a lot for Gutekunst to move up all the way to the middle of the first round. It's a good question, though, Gary. Thank you so much. Let's go over to our friend Josh on Facebook. Josh wants to know, does the coaching staff have input on who Brian Gutekunst should draft? How much does Gutekunst rely on head coach Matt LaFleur or even new defensive coordinator Joe Barry when he makes these decisions about the personnel?
He listens to their evaluation, just like he listens to the evaluation of his scouts. But I don't believe they are in the room. I think Matt LaFleur is in the room, but no other coaches are in the draft room. So this is a personnel department show. And they are curious, what does this guy look like to you in your particular offense? How does he translate to that? Could he play for you? What do you think of his personality? Things like that. But when it comes to just making the pick, that's all Gutekunst and his staff. They're gonna, even if that guy doesn't fit exactly what that defensive guy is, they're gonna, if they think this guy is going to be a Pro Bowl player, they're going to take him, and it's up to the coach to adjust.
Thank you so much, Josh, for your question. Jim over on Facebook wants to know, with the difficult salary cap issues the next 2 years, is the draft this year more important than years past? The Packers are in a situation that really every team across the league is in. The Packers in particular this offseason pushed more and more money into future cap years because they needed to keep the cap low this year due to COVID-19. The cap fell a little bit. Looking ahead to the coming years, the Packers are hopeful, and every NFL team is hopeful, that the salary cap is going to rise due to the new TV deals that the league signed. However, that money might not kick in until maybe a couple years from now. How is Gutekunst navigating this year's draft, keeping in mind that the Packers are going to have some salary cap woes in 2022?
Yeah, the thing you can't do is just have a junk draft. This is the worst year to have a draft where you only get like one guy out of it or two guys, sort of like the 2017 draft the Packers had. You have to have a really good draft because you want as many picks as you can get, and you want as many of those guys to be on your roster next year when their salaries are low. You want them to be competing for spots. I think if the Packers were able to do what they did last year, where they have a number of guys who are going to be on the roster. I mean, Jordan Love's going to be on the roster. Dillon's going to be on the roster. DeGuara is going to be on the roster. John Runyon's going to be on the roster. Kamal Martin's going to be on the roster. That's what you want. You want those guys at least to make your team, and then next year they're pushing. So I think teams are going to be trying to get as many picks as they can, collect as many picks as they can, and Gutekunst won't be any different, except that he's got 10. So I wouldn't be surprised if he uses every single one where it stands.
It's an absolutely good point there you make, Jim. Thank you so much for your question. Let's take a question here from Levi. Levi wants to know, in terms of wide receiver interest that the Packers may have in the first round, Rashad Bateman, Terrace Marshall are both around 6'2". I think Bateman is a little bit shorter. Would the Packers potentially be interested in either of them? Or maybe someone like Elijah Moore, who's quite a bit shorter, more of a prototypical slot receiver type at 5'9". How likely is it that the Packers are interested in any of those three at number 29?
Possible. I definitely think they're in a spot. They don't take wide receivers in the first round, but it's not like they're exactly picking. They're practically picking in the second round. So, they could take a Bateman there. I don't think that would be, out of the ordinary for them. I don't see him taking a slot guy there, though. There's so many slot receivers in this draft that I can't see him wasting an early pick on a guy who might just be a gadget player. Moore does not fit their height, weight requirements. And, Bateman is just there. He's 6 foot, I think. So I think you can get a slot receiver in the third or fourth round. And so I would I have a feeling they'll address other needs in the first round. And then second round, there will be all kinds of receivers there.
Thanks so much, Levi, for your question. Let's take a question from our friend Katie over on YouTube. Katie says, how big of a shock was it that the Packers drafted quarterback Jordan Love in the first round last year? And do you see anyone as a big shock this upcoming draft? Looking back to last year's draft, yes, in the moment it was somewhat shocking that the Packers drafted a quarterback. However, working through the logic now, it doesn't not make sense for the Packers to draft a steady backup and someone to develop behind Aaron Rodgers. That being said, Is there anyone in this year's draft, certainly position, that would surprise you if general manager Brian Gutekunst went that way?
Yeah, if he drafted the kid from Louisville, Tutu Atwell, who's like 5'9" and 155 pounds, and he went with that kid, I would fall off my chair because he breaks every rule that they have. Maybe if they surprised everybody and took Quinn Miners, the center from Whitewater, really high, that would kind of knock me over. Maybe if they took a running back in the second round or something like that, that would be pretty surprising. But I don't think you can beat them taking a quarterback last year. I mean, we knew they were interested in quarterbacks. They had brought in a bunch of the top quarterbacks for visits prior to the draft last year. And so they had kind of made it known that, maybe they might be interested in one of those guys if he fell into their lap. And sure enough, they did. So it's going to be hard to top that one. A corner or a quarterback in the first round. Yeah, maybe if they draft another one, maybe if Mac Jones is there and they take him, that would be interesting.
You never know. You've seen a lot over the years, Tom. Perhaps it's a little bit hard to surprise you at this point. Thank you, Katie, for your question. Let's go over to Chase on Facebook. Chase wants to know, Tom, if you think that the arch rival Chicago Bears reach has to go up and grab a falling quarterback now that Denver has Teddy Bridgewater and may not go for a quarterback. Earlier today, the Carolina Panthers dealt Bridgewater to the Denver Broncos. It's a big question whether or not they're going to take a quarterback. It still could happen. They could still be in the running for a quarterback in the first round. However, the Bears currently, who signed Andy Dalton in the offseason at quarterback, do they need a quarterback too? Where are these quarterbacks going to fall in the first round, Tom?
Well, I think the Bears, they could use a quarterback, but I don't think they have to panic. I mean, I think Andy Dalton is a functional starter. I think you could do a lot worse than him. Last year with Dallas, it was unfortunate. Their offensive line was terrible, and it was just a bad situation for him. But I think he could come on and solidify this spot. I'm not saying he's taken them to the Super Bowl, but it would take a little pressure off them if they see that the quarterback they like, whoever that might be, isn't going to fall to them. Then they don't have to do a Mitch Trubisky and trade their whole draft to move up, a spot or two. So I think they have some options. I still think Denver might take a quarterback. I wouldn't put all my money on Teddy Bridgewater, although they have Drew Lock too. Maybe that does satisfy their quarterback need.
I'm not convinced. I have a feeling that the Panthers still will be in the market for a quarterback in the first round. Don't hold me to that. However, it's how I'm feeling today. Thank you, Chase, for your question. Let's take a question here from Mitchell on Facebook. Mitchell says that the first pick should be an inside linebacker, get a wide receiver in the second round. The Packers have a pretty thin inside linebackers group. However, they do have some confidence in two second-year players, both Kamal Martin and Chris Barnes, to play in the center of the field in this Packers defense. How much of a priority is inside linebacker in this year's draft as the Packers continue to assemble the defense?
Well, I don't view them as being thin. I think they have as good a talent as they've had there in a while. Chris Barnes is a really just solid player. He's not gonna, he's not gonna be C.J. Mosley. He's not Devin White or Levante David. He's just a guy you can probably win with. And Kamal Martin, I'm still wonder how good he can be. He's got really good explosiveness. I don't think they have to panic on that position. And I also think with Joe Barry, if they do play this five-man front in their nickel, it de-emphasizes the inside linebacker. Then you're just looking for a guy who can cover. And, you could probably get one of those later in the round. You could get a big safety who you could put in as a nickel linebacker. So I don't see that as a need. And unless they just really love a guy as an athlete. If you just absolutely love a guy as an athlete and think he can cover, ground sideline to sideline, then yeah, take him. But I don't feel like they have to.
Packers fans, I encourage you to go check out our first round mock draft from all of our Packers News reporters. Some of our fellow colleagues, Tom, will disagree with you. Definitely check it out. Thank you, Mitchell, for your question. Let's take a question here from Smumster over on Periscope. Why does everyone in football land, I like that phrase, football land, think the Packers need an offensive line in round one? Offensive linemen. They drafted 3 in a row last year. That is correct. The Packers drafted guard John Runyon Jr., center Jake Hansen, and guard Simon Stepanek in last year's draft. Only Runyon saw any substantial playing time. Both Hansen and Stepanek were injured for most of the season, if not all of the season in Hansen's case. However, the Packers have some offensive line fluidity going on with left tackle David Bakhtiari out recovering with an ACL injury, and then center Corey Linsley departing in free agency. How high of a priority is offensive line in this year's draft for the Packers?
I think it's high. I think you got to keep building your offensive line. You lost a really good player in Corey Linsley, and I think you got Billy Turner for one more year, I believe. You have to continually keep restocking your offensive line. And when you have a chance to get a first rounder who, you think could start, you got to do it. I mean, the year after the Packers won the Super Bowl, they drafted a left tackle, Brian Balaga. And look how that turned out. He turned out not to be their left tackle, but he's filled in at right tackle. And I'm sorry, he got picked in 2010. But yeah, he was their right tackle of the future. And, there were a lot of people thought he had short arms. Anyway, if you have the chance to get someone you can stick in one spot for 10 years, you got to try to do it. And the first round is a good place to take offensive linemen. I think there's a big difference between guys in the first and guys in the sixth. You can get good players as David Bakhtiari, Linsley, those guys, but it's nice to get a first rounder once in a while too.
We'll see if any of the top offensive tackles are there when the Packers pick at 29. Thank you so much, Smumster, for your question, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Tom and I will be back to chat with you after the Packers make their first pick in the draft tomorrow. I cannot believe I am saying that. It is finally here. Make sure you're checking out PackersNews.com for all of your Packers coverage. For Tom Silverstein, I am Olivia Reiner. We will see you next time.